I am the co-founder of Perception Institute, along with my colleague Rachel Godsill. We created the Perception Institute 9 years ago, and we were concerned largely about the racial anxiety in the electorate under then candidate Obama. Here we are 9 years later, still hard at work and still very concerned about the impact that race and racial anxiety is having. So we work with a group of social psychologists and strategists and social scientists to translate some of the best science around how our brain works into policies and practices and ways that we can transform every sector to live our clear and core values. So the state of race in America, I was trying to figure out a word without, saying something awful or inappropriate that couldn't be broadcast on TV. It's challenging, it is sad, it is hard. But at Perception, we think of it as a complete paradox, a contradiction in terms, because we know that most Americans, 89% of Americans, actually believe in the equal treatment of each other. And yet, somehow, all of the disparities, litany of disparities that both David and Charlie spoke about are the challenges that we are wrestling with. So how can it be that we can believe so much in fairness and yet still have these challenges? We know that our brains, when we experience explicit bias, we have a reaction. This actually gives me hope. When we see things like the travel ban, we see Muslims are being targeted and harassed. I'm not sure where to click, guys. When we see Charlottesville, right, in August of 2017, we had a visceral response, right? We had this idea that white supremacy on the rise, anti-Semitism on the rise. It hurts our hearts because it's completely inconsistent with what our core values are. When Dylan Roof walked into Mother Emanuel Baptist Church in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot 9 parishioners who were praying at the time, we understand that bias is completely unacceptable, and we have a visceral reaction, and that actually should be the grounding of why we believe so much in fairness. It should really give us hope, the fact that we have a muscle towards explicit bias. We also know that when we have what we call like a preponderance of evidence, we can start to see patterns of bias that make us understand that things are not the same between races in America. So when a Yale student is napping in her common room and has to show ID, the police are called in. When a family is barbecuing around Lake Merritt in Oakland, and the police are also called. When a border patrol stops a citizen for speaking Spanish in an area where perhaps Spanish should not be spoken in Montana, we understand that there is a huge difference. When college teenagers or prospective college teenagers, Native Americans, are on a college tour and a mother calls the police because they just don't seem like they belong, that is of concern. Starbucks, obviously, full disclosure, Perception Institute is co-created some of the content for next Tuesday's day, but the fact that a corporation can respond so intensively and commit to foregoing a day of revenue because they are so concerned with the impact both on their bottom line, but also on the morale within their own frontline staff, we should recognize the fact that they recognize how race is operating. When our White House shares their own perspective in a very dehumanizing way about members of MS-13, literally calling them animals, moving them away from the very humanity that we hope to all aspire to, even if we fall short, we can see the preponderance of evidence of how race still matters. But if we, on whole, reject racism, how do we account for the racial disparities? How do we account for the very disparities we were just talking about? This is a study that, a field study of 940,000 children who went into the hospital, to the ER rooms to be treated with appendicitis. This is a period of time where they looked at this big N between the years 2003 and 2010. What the researchers wanted to understand was whether or not the patients, the children patients, were receiving the appropriate level of pain medication. And what they found, the appropriate level, anybody here have appendicitis ever? I hear it's quite, my colleague had it, she said it was worse than childbirth, so I presume that it is an extreme amount of pain. What they found was that children white children were 3 times more likely to receive opiate pain medication than the black children. 3 times more likely. The black children with the same amount of pain were given an analgesic like Tylenol. So it's not as though the doctors, 940,000 doctors, we can't account for that by just saying they were all racist. We cannot account for it by saying that they had some, that they were trying to be malicious towards children. They were seeing their patients. They were believing that they were offering the best diagnosis and treatment at the time. And yet, here we have these very, very stark disparities that went to perceptions of pain tolerance, that the black children could tolerate pain better than the white children. So we call this at perception the fairness paradox. We do believe that most people aspire to fairness, they believe in fairness, and yet, again, when we look at the range of challenges, we believe it's undermined. So here's our paradoxical statement. Just because we believe in fairness doesn't mean we are fair. Just because we believe in fairness does not mean that our value, our core value, will actually align with our outcomes. So at perception, one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves is perhaps the way that we've been taught to practice fairness is flawed. It's not that we are not trying to practice fairness every day, but perhaps we've been taught incorrectly. And I'm going to argue today that the 3 ways in which we've been taught to practice fairness, particularly in this country, have been colorblindness, objectivity, and meritocracy. Can the mind sciences actually help us make meaning of this paradox? We're going to talk about how our brains operate, implicit bias, which has become a bit of a silver bullet these days, but there are other operating phenomena, particularly racial anxiety, that get in the way and make these conversations so hard. And then perhaps we could talk about the barriers that limit our ability to address and resolve the paradox. So I'll start with objectivity, which we define as lacking bias, judgment, and prejudice in how we see each other. So how objective can we really be? I don't see anybody, obviously we can't bring drinks in this room, but for those of you who are drinking coffee, anybody sneak a coffee in here? I'm going to talk to you, because when people are holding warm cups of items, you may be receiving me more warmly. Your brain is just kind of giving you a vibe, and it's going to make you see me in a more likable way. For those of you who are drinking ice water, I'm going to try to avoid your gaze, because if you are holding a glass of ice water, you're more likely to see things coolly. Here's a pro tip. If you're going in for an interview or you're going to talk about a promotion, bring somebody, your boss, a cup of coffee. If, on the other hand, you have to tell somebody bad news, it's better to give them a cup of cold water, because they're more likely to acclimate to the bad news once they're already holding that cup of ice water. So that's a silly way to say that in all ways our objectivity about someone, the way we see someone, the way we feel about someone, can be undermined in very random ways. But what about those ways in which we can't change, right? We can't decide whether or not we're holding a cup of coffee, or if the other person is holding a cup of coffee or not. What about the ways in which our brains automatically create these responses and these stereotypes that we just can't seem to turn off? So for the skeptics in the room, I'm not sure if there's skeptics in the room around bias, I would like to just do one quick collective exercise, and it's really important. This is group participation is required. I'm going to ask you to state the color of the text. I'm not sure how many of you all can see it, but let's try one. Okay, a little bit louder. Blue. Okay, ready? Let's go. Red, green, black, green, red. Okay. All right. Oh, I don't know about the state of race in America, but I will tell you, the state of reading and the state of following directions in this room certainly is a challenge. So what happened? We got to here, right? We got to a word where the color, you guys were all kind of rolling along with me for the first 5 words when the colors were consistent with the actual text. And then when I asked you to, when the word switched, it became schema inconsistent, your brain was like, what? And you could kind of feel it too, right? Whose brain felt a little like awkward and weird? Now that I've told you the trick, you can see this is the same slide. I'd like for us to do it again together. One more time. Ready? All right, give yourselves a round of applause. That's really hard. That's really hard, but you know what? The reason why we do it twice is because it's so important for us to understand the fact that we are not at the mercy of our automatic brains. Our brains process 11 million bits of information unconsciously in the same amount of time that we process 40 bits of information consciously. So our brains have to create what we call schemas in order just to navigate, in order just to build knowledge. So that idea, right, that our brains are able to help us get through the world means that we sometimes have to rely on schemas about people. We have to know who is a friend, who is a foe. We have to know who is part of my family, who is the person who's going to help me get my way through school, who's the person who's going to help me create more opportunity, and who is not. We create these categories in our brains every day, these schemas, these mental structures that help us organize information. They help us do it in a way that's very efficient, and we do it very quickly. Stereotypes are schemas about people. There are the actual traits, the characteristics that we think about with respect to people, but we also have attitudes when we think about people. We can have warm attitudes and negative attitudes, and they not always go in the same direction. So sometimes you can have a positive stereotype about someone and a negative attitude, and vice versa. The elderly, for example, we have tremendously warm attitudes. We believe so much in, the wisdom, and we think about our holiday dinners and our grandparents and warmth, and yet we have negative stereotypes about their ability to drive, to stay current, to think about the latest technology. Any society that has both the negative stereotypes and negative attitudes towards a group of people, that group of people will be among the most vulnerable. A key to practicing fairness, I'm going to argue, is to learn how to de-link stereotypes. It's not as simple as just checking bias at the door. Oh my goodness. So a teacher, when we think of teacher, we often think of, right, a woman. When we think of pilot, we don't always think of a woman, and certainly not a woman of color. Stereotypes persist about some people and not about others. This is a depiction of how the Irish would have been depicted. The woman on the right would have been depicted in the 1860s, and yet when we think of her now, right, she would have come over from the potato famine. She would have been considered uneducable. She would have been considered promiscuous, perhaps drunk. And yet now, the only stereotype that perhaps we still have may be of drinking on St. Paddy's Day. It's not a stereotype that actually gets in the way. And in large part because the Irish became white. They became white through, as many of us know, through government investment in FHA loans that helped create neighborhoods for all of the Irish to connect and live together with other ethnic groups. The stereotypes that apply to the Irish and Germans now actually apply to Latinos. So when we look at a content analysis of Fox, MSNBC, and network news, we can see that the stereotypes that Latinos are on welfare, take our jobs, refuse to speak English, and have too many kids likewise would have applied to ethnic groups in the 1800s and 1900s. Now we think of them in relationship to Latinos. And for those of us who don't watch TV, content analysis that looks at just how words are paired throughout books and magazines can also show high correlations between various stereotypes. So the idea is media is incredibly important in how we bring these concepts together and how our brains function. Who we perceive as poor in America. We used to think about protecting mothers and soldiers during the Great Depression, and then we had a stereotype of a welfare queen. Because there is a model minority stereotype about Asians, we don't recognize the fact that Asians are the fastest growing group to be impoverished in many of our urban cities, and the resources that we would as a community offer them, we don't do. Oops. Sorry, my clicker is so slow. Yikes. We perceive threat earlier than we think. For young African-American children, there was a study, we all know kind of stereotypes about masculinity and black masculinity and crime. This is a study where participants were asked to find an image in a set of pixelated dots. Right before that, they were primed with an image of a 5-year-old child, one white, one black. When they asked them to circle the first picture they found, for the white child, they found a toy. For the black child, they found a gun. So our perceptions, the opportunities that we're actually thinking about and creating in our brains, we're starting to actually look at children in much different ways. So all of this means that social identity, it matters. It matters in how we see ourselves. Colorblindness, we know, as a true aspiration, right? Many have interpreted, I think incorrectly, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, and the idea that we can be colorblind and yet our brains can somehow turn off noticing difference is completely inconsistent with the science. It actually creates what we call a racial anxiety. A stress response that is linked to a cross-racial interaction, and it shows up differently. For people of color, our concern is that perhaps there may be some level of discrimination coming towards us, some that we need to be on guard with. And for whites, it's a fear that something you're saying is going to land as potentially racist. And that disconnect where essentially two executive brains are going into fight or flight mode, creates a challenge, right? It creates more awkward interactions, shorter interactions, and quite frankly, avoidance. Because of this, we see discrimination differently. We see when students are given a series of hiring scenarios that are blatant or ambiguous, white students who see the blatant discrimination are unable to take that Stroop test at all. Their brains just go completely haywire, whereas black students who see blatant discrimination, they can still go about their day because they actually have a schema for it. On the reverse, ambiguous discrimination, when white students give an explanation for why, a reasonable explanation for why discrimination, even though it's still the same discrimination, has occurred, they are much more likely to resolve it in their brains and move on with their day. Whereas people of color, that nagging feeling, not only am I seeing the discrimination and is this real, but if I say it, if I name it, will I be believed? It's a huge challenge. In terms of how we interact with each other with respect to what we presume in terms of respect. Another series of studies looked at what our goals were when we interact with each other. If we are white, we normally are trying to focus on being liked in an interaction when we first meet someone, and so we project warmth. If we're people of color, we don't presume respect, and so we actually have to establish agency, use agency and seriousness to establish our credentials and our level of respect. Again, if you have someone with an incredibly warm attitude and someone with an incredibly cool attitude, and they start to interact, they're reconfirming the worst about each other. Asians both assume competence and respect, and so they can focus on being liked in a cross-white interaction. So the ways that we show up in conversations, even if we're just trying to evaluate each other just as regular individuals and deconstruct ourselves from our social identities, doesn't work because we're so primed in this behavior. We know that meritocracy is obviously a huge aspiration for those of us in America when we talk about, particularly about the American dream. And yet recent studies have suggested that even organizations that are committed to meritocratic ideals and diverse ideals still pay women, people of color, and people who are foreign-born less. Not only that, they believe in their own objectivity, even though I've just explained how much objectivity can be undermined. So when we think about the aspirations that we have towards colorblindness, towards being objective when it comes to people, and towards meritocracy, it just raises huge questions for us as to whether or not we can actually move from the paradox to what we call a paradigm shift. How do we delink those stereotypes? Individuation is one of the most important ways to do that. What is the daily practice that we can do to delink stereotypes when we see folks? Learning detailed information about people so that we know can actually help us retrain our brains in ways that are really important. When we think of astronaut, we don't think of a Latino woman. How do we actually, Mazrin Banaji, who created one of the co-creators of the implicit association test, has a screensaver that has counter stereotypes on it. So she challenges herself every single day to not fall into the traps of seeing each other and as dehumanized or as other. We believe at Perception that this conversation that you will have today, both around the politics of identity and the conversation around speech, require us to understand how important social identity is, how important social identity has been in terms of helping us understand our set of shared experiences, but also that the conversations that we have can become more respectful if we build that muscle, the same muscle that we have when we see hate, when we express that muscle. If we build that same muscle around delinking the stereotypes actively in our everyday practice, that it actually makes something like hate speech less effective. Thank you so much for having me.